release of women and children. Also this hour, we have an update on the health of premature babies evacuated from our senior international correspondent, Orla Guerin, and a warning that her report contains some distressing images from the start.
Every day, more bodies, more Palestinians killed in Israel's assault, some who barely started living. This footage was filmed for the BBC today in Han Yunis in the south. Israel told people to flee here to be safer. The bereaved get one last look. And a father, one last embrace. The agony of Samir Jamil Adar, cradling his 5-year-old son, Mohammed. Then his other son is brought to him, 6-year-old Samir. He can't bear to let him go. Parted forever. Palestinians say the boys were among 30 people killed when Israel bombed several houses in Han Yunis. But finally, some hope for around 30 premature babies, seen here today being checked by doctors in Rafah in southern Gaza. The World Health Organization got them out of Al-Shifa hospital, which it says is a death zone. They are due to be moved to Egypt. And in Israel, many are still enveloped by grief, still saying goodbye. Here they honor a passionate campaigner for peace. Vivian Silver was a Canadian-Israeli activist. If Palestinians were allowed into Israel for medical treatment, she drove them to hospital. When Hamas attacked her kibbutz near the Gaza border, she was burned to death inside her home. Her son, Jonathan, said her peace movement had been orphaned by her death. Her clear voice had been silenced. But fellow campaigners told us they will keep going.
It's very hard to us, but the way of Vivian give us the hope for all of us here to see all these people that we must walk in the way of the peace.
Do you think that is still possible now with Israel and the Palestinians?
We must believe in this way because this is the solution.
But Israel's peace camp has been dwindling for years. Since October 7th, it is reeling.
Because of Vivian.
Another war is underway in Gaza, something Vivian Silver hoped would not be repeated. The grief here is for a beloved mother and grandmother, but also for a vision of a different future.
A report from our senior international correspondent, Orla Guerin. Now, we want to bring you some new footage which has just been released by the Israel Defense Forces in the last half hour or so. I should say the BBC has not been able to independently verify these videos. Israel says this is footage of the entrance to a tunnel underneath the Al-Shifa hospital. Now, the IDF says based on its intelligence, troops have exposed a tunnel 55 meters in length, going down 10 meters underneath the complex. It says the tunnel shaft was uncovered in the area of the hospital underneath a shed alongside a vehicle containing numerous weapons, including RPGs, explosives, and Kalashnikov rifles. Israel says the entrance of the tunnel shaft includes a blast-proof door and firing hole. It reports that its forces are continuing to uncover the route of the tunnel. Now, as I say, this is footage which has been released by the Israel Defense Forces. The BBC has not been able to independently verify this footage. Israel, a few days ago, released videos of what it said were tunnels underneath a different hospital elsewhere in Gaza, which again the BBC had not at the time been able to independently verify. Israeli spokespeople have previously said there are miles and miles of tunnels underneath this hospital, the Al Shifa hospital in Gaza. Well, let's go to our correspondent, Nick Beek, now for much more on this. Nick, what do we need to know about this and how it substantiates the Israeli position?
Well, Israel certainly thinks that it's slowly building up a compelling case to justify its operation at the Al Shifa hospital. It's said that Hamas has this large headquarters right underneath the medical center, and that this was the justification for the huge military operation, even though lots of patients remained inside and lots of other people who lived in this part of northern Gaza who'd sought shelter at the place. And as you described, the footage that the IDF have released tonight does come with some information from the Israeli military. They talk about a 55-meter long tunnel, 10 meters deep. They say the first 3 meters of that is a ladder, and then another 7 meters of a spiral staircase. They also say at some point at the end of the tunnel, there is a blast door, which would have been used by Hamas. And in the words of the Israeli military, they say the findings clearly prove that numerous buildings in the hospital complex are used by Hamas as cover for terrorist infrastructure and activity. So, as I say, the Israelis are keen to show what they've been uncovering. And yes, I think it's important to make that point, Rich, as you did a short time ago, that we at the BBC haven't been able to independently verify this. This is material the Israelis have put out this evening.
Nick, some of our colleagues have joined the IDF on operations, heavily supervised. Their movements have been controlled. Has there been any suggestion by Israel that they might be willing to allow more journalists to join them as they uncover these tunnels?
Well, certainly in the hours and days to come, that was the message from the Israeli government today. More evidence will be presented. And already, as we've seen, the Israelis have given journalists, admittedly, a limited window, including the BBC, an opportunity to see the Al Shifa complex, which, of course, is at the heart of where the fighting has been, and also at the heart of this claim. Hamas says there isn't any terror infrastructure underneath the hospital. So we'll have to wait and see whether there is an invitation that's put out to various media organizations, global or otherwise, to come and see what the Israelis have found. But I think we'll probably see this, as well as in the hours or days to come, more video put forward by the Israelis saying that this is building up the picture that there was a Hamas headquarters underneath the Al Shifa hospital. As I say, Hamas have always denied this, and some of the doctors we've been talking to over the past couple of weeks who've been at the hospital, they've said they're not aware of a complex underneath. So this is a very contested claim, and Israel tonight providing this latest video.
Okay, Nick Beek, our correspondent in Jerusalem, thank you very much. Well, I spoke to Mark Regev in Tel Aviv. He's a senior advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister. This is what he had to say about the tunnels under Al Shifa Hospital.
Obviously, one doesn't go into tunnels uncarefully. One must be very reticent, because there are issues with booby traps and with other things that Hamas will have left for our forces. But it's only a matter of time. And I'd remind you, it's not just Israel that says that there's an underground military complex immediately beneath the hospital. There is, of course, the Americans. Their intelligence has said so in parallel to ours. And it's been said both by the Pentagon and the White House. And I think if one wants to speak really honestly, the people of the area who've worked in the hospital know full well that there is a Hamas military fortification and structure underneath the hospital. They just can't say so to Western press, because they know they will face violent retribution from Hamas that doesn't appreciate people speaking out of turn.
Well, I appreciate the point you're saying that about other intelligence agencies supporting Israel's claim. On the point of medics that you mentioned, and again, I accept your point when it comes to people talking within Gaza, which is controlled by Hamas. I interviewed a British medic about this time yesterday who has spent a considerable amount of time in Gaza. He said he's never seen any evidence of the hospital being run by Hamas militia. He said this contention by the IDF is, and I use his words here, utterly fanciful from his perspective. He did concede he has no idea what's going on underneath the hospital, but he said he has walked every inch of that hospital, and he sees no evidence that he believes that it's being used by Hamas. How would you respond to that?
I would respond by saying the following. I mean, the fact that the hospital is governed by Hamas is the director of the hospital was chosen by Hamas. He's a Hamas appointee. And the fact that we've already found inside the hospital ammunition, vests, explosives, and so forth, he obviously didn't see that. Maybe he didn't want to see that, or they were hidden from him. But that's a sideshow. The most important thing is the military structure underneath the hospital. He, of course, said he has not been down there, so he can't see it. But I believe, as I say, in the next hours or in the next days, we will be showing conclusive evidence. And once again, if the idea that there's an underground military complex underneath the hospital is somehow a secret, it's one of the worst kept secrets in Gaza City. It's common knowledge to the people of Gaza.
Mark Regev, their spokesperson for the Israeli government, and I just want to bring you an update on the death toll in Gaza. This coming into us from the AFP news agency. The Hamas government in Gaza now saying the death toll in the territory has now reached 13,000. Well, meanwhile, these premature babies who have been moved from the Al-Shifa hospital in northern Gaza, which has been the scene of much fighting, have gone to the Emirati hospital in Rafah in the south of Gaza. These pictures have emerged medical provision made caring for them in Al-Shifa very difficult. Teams are now working to stabilize their condition. Here's the Director General of the Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza.
We found that even the water with which their baby formula was made was polluted. It wasn't sanitized because sanitization was not available, and that caused vomiting, diarrhea, and weight loss. Instead of gaining weight, they lost weight, and that caused them severe harm. Some of them had sepsis and severe inflammation. We began a quick resuscitation process for them as soon as they arrived at the hospital. They also had low temperatures. They hadn't been kept warm. We usually assign one nurse to every 2 or 3 babies, but the medical staff was greatly reduced due to the siege around the Al-Shifa hospital and the staff's inability to change shifts. There were severe shortages in medicine, like antibiotics, other solutions and food, and that was banned by the occupying powers from reaching the Al-Shifa medical complex. It took hours of work and coordination. The medical staff, that's 1 doctor and the 4 nurses who were with them, finally arrived. The final number who came to us was 31 babies. There had originally been 39, but 8 babies died, the final 2 of which died in the Al-Shifa medical complex. Some of the babies are in critical condition. One of them is on a ventilator. There are some who are critical, others in medium conditions, some who are stable, whose health condition allows them to be fed directly with baby formula or through tubes.
Well, earlier on today, Qatar's Prime Minister spoke to reporters in Doha and said only minor obstacles remain in the way of reaching a deal to release some of the hostages who were taken by Hamas. His comments came after the Washington Post said Israel, Hamas and the US were close to an agreement on the release of women and children. Well, let's go live now to Giorgio Cafiero, who's the CEO and founder of Gulf State Analytics, a Middle East geopolitical risk consultancy. He joins us from LA. Mr. Cafiero, thank you very much for being with us. Why Qatar? Why is it playing such a pivotal role here?
No one is surprised that Qatar is playing this role. The Gulf country has, on so many occasions in the past, helped out with this kind of difficult mediation. I'm sure your viewers remember it was only in September when Qatar, along with Switzerland and the Sultanate of Oman, played this critical mediating role that led to the prisoner swap between the US and Iran. When it comes to Gaza, Qatar is an Arab state that has some very unique cards to play. This really has to do with the fact that Qatar is on very good terms with Hamas. Hamas's exiled political leadership has been based in Doha since 2012, and Western governments often engage Hamas via the Doha back channel.
So how hopeful are you that a deal will be forthcoming sooner rather than later?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic. Of course, there are things that can go wrong that can totally derail it. So a successful deal being brokered is definitely not inevitable. But I think in Gaza, there is real hope for at least, at minimum, a few days of, halt to the Israeli bombardments. Obviously, a permanent ceasefire is what the people of Gaza need, but a pause for a few days would be very beneficial to the 2.3 million Palestinians trapped in Gaza. And then on the Israeli side, the fact that over 200 hostages are still being held in Gaza by Hamas has added to the trauma that Israelis have been suffering since October 7th. It is becoming a pretty big political issue in Israel. A lot of pressure coming down on the Israeli leadership to do something to reunite these hostages with their loved ones. And I think with the US trying to push this through and Qatar working very hard, we should note that these efforts on Doha's part began last month, actually. I think given these factors, there's reason to be, as I said, cautiously optimistic.
Okay, Giorgio Cafiero, founder of Gulf State Analytics. Mr. Cafiero, thank you very much for your insights. Appreciate it. Let's go to South America now, and voting's underway in the second round of Argentina's presidential election. The polls being dominated by an escalating economic crisis, with inflation running at more than 140%. Polls suggest it will be a tight race between Sergio Massa and a right-wing outsider, Javier Milei. Mr. Massa is the current economy minister. He won the first round of voting with just over 36.5%, ahead of Mr. Milei with 30%. Well, let's go live now to Buenos Aires and Natalio Casoy, an Argentinian journalist who's at one of the polling stations, or just outside, I think. Natalio, talk us through some of the big issues at play here.
Well, I think, as you well pointed out, the main issue here is the economy. The economic situation is very dire in Argentina. The crisis has been going on for too long for Argentinian citizens. The very high inflation makes it very difficult to organize life, to buy things, to save. And that's affecting people, but it's also affecting business. And that's why Javier Milei, with his unconventional economic ideas, like the idea of dollarizing the country and getting rid of the Argentinian currency, the peso, or closing down the central bank as a means to control inflation, became attractive to part of the population. And that put, at the same time, Sergio Massa in a difficult position. And that's why it's interesting also to have seen such a good performance by Massa in the first round. I think the issue here that we need to highlight is why Massa had that good a performance, and why are we calling a tight race if he's the economic minister of the current government? Well, possibly because people that don't vote for Milei are afraid of him, are worried that maybe it's too much. They are uncertain of what a government by Milei might be, and it might be too far off to the right. So I think these are the key issues in Argentina in this election.
In the first round of voting, Mr. Milei was tipped to win. He was ahead in the polls. That didn't happen. It went to Mr. Massa, as you said. What are the polls saying about this runoff vote, and can we trust them?
Well, we cannot talk about the polls now because the law doesn't allow us to discuss the polls until the polling stations are closed in a few hours. But what we can say is that what happened in the first round, and this is interesting to understand, is that the right-wing vote was split between Javier Milei and another force headed by Patricia Bullrich. Patricia Bullrich, after the first round, said she would support Javier Milei. So we're counting that most of her votes will go to him, and she got 23% of the vote then in the first round. Possibly not all of her votes will go to Javier Milei, but probably some or most of them. And then the other votes that were not cast to either Milei or Massa will need to see which way they go. There were many people. There were a lot of people that didn't choose any candidate in the first round, and we also need to see who they will be picking up this time.
Okay, Natalio Casoy joining us from the streets of Buenos Aires. Natalio, thank you very much. Now, a hat worn by Napoleon Bonaparte when he ruled the French Empire in the 19th century has sold at auction in France for $2.1 million. That's around 1.9 million euros, much higher than the auction house had anticipated. Napoleon's hat became a central part of his image. The military commander famously wore his headgear sideways to make him recognizable on the battlefield. Well, let's go live now to Dr. Estelle Peronk, an associate professor in history at Northeastern University in London. Dr. Peronk, very good to talk to you. Give us the quick history 101 on why Napoleon Bonaparte was important.
Well, that's a very difficult question in many ways. I guess it's important because he arrived at a time where there was so much chaos in France, and he marked not just French history, but also European history. But I have to admit that there is so much interest in him that sometimes even me, a French citizen and a French historian, is a bit puzzled of why he is so adored and loved. Yes, he has accomplished amazing things. I mean, he was a military genius and he was a political leader as well, of course. But at the same time, he made lots of mistakes. He was not perfect. And I think it is okay to say that without being anti-French. And so I think it's important to say it. And I think that it is also remarkable that there is so much interest in him. As you said, like his hat, that is so recognizable. Like, so for so much money. I mean, I don't think he would have predicted that himself.
Well, talk to us more about his hat and his image, because of course this is long before social media and photographs. How important was the image of the emperor to the man himself, and what role did his hat play in that?
Well, his hat was very recognizable. There's how he's, there's almost a form of persona behind his hat for himself. And I think it's part of, and hear me out here, of a Napoleon's own ego of being, doing a propaganda, if you want, around himself. Obviously, he knew how things worked. He was definitely a very intelligent man, and he knew that it was not just about the battles and the battlefields, but it was also about how he was going to portray himself. So the hat was a huge, important thing for him and his persona and how he would be recognized. It's part, if you want, almost of his own glory, but it also meant that he was recognizable by his men. It is something that helped him building almost like his own image with his men and with his enemies.
Okay, an important bit of clothing. It wasn't you who bought it, was it?
Have that money.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Dr. Estelle Prolong joining us
so
from Northeastern University London. Thank you so much. And before we go, I just want to remind you of the footage which has been released to media outlets within the last hour or so. This has been released by the Israel Defense Forces, which says this is footage of a tunnel underneath the Al-Shifa hospital complex. Now, Israel has been saying for some time that the Al-Shifa hospital, Gaza's biggest hospital, has been used as a command and control center by Hamas, which it considers a terrorist organization. It's released this footage, which it says is based on intelligence and exposes a tunnel 55 meters in length, 10 meters under the complex. It says the tunnel shaft was uncovered in an area of the hospital underneath a shed alongside a vehicle containing numerous weapons, including RPGs and explosives. And it is important to point out that the BBC has not been able to independently verify this footage. It's been released to us by the Israeli military. Much more on that still to come here on BBC News.